Hello. Happy Monday. Gosh darn, I just love the energy in the room. I apologize for being the one to interrupt. However, it's time to start our meeting. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please join me in reciting our four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? I'd like to now invite Angie Hillstead up for today's invocation. Angie?
Thank you, President Cindy. Hi, fellow Rotarians. Please join me in prayer if you wish. From the words of Proverbs chapter 31, verse 31, honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Thank you, Lord, for giving us our mothers, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, and special women in our lives. You have blessed us with their strength and love, just as you blessed your son with the strength and love of his mother. From the words of my mother, may the sun shine on your face and there be laughter in your heart. Amen.
I would like to welcome all of our guests and invite them all to stand today. We're so glad to have you with us. So if you are a guest, please stand so we can say hello, and we're so glad to have you here today. We have a few. For those of you I have not met before, this is, wow. Are we good? Okay, sorry. I was right in the microphone. For those of you I have not met before, my name is Cindy Peterson. I have the privilege and honor of being president of Downtown Rotary. Our Rotary business today includes 3-member inductions. So if those who are being inducted and their sponsors or their surrogate sponsor is here and ready to go, I'm going to have you come head this way. And gosh darn, Joel, you're first, since you got up here first. Joel Sylvester here to introduce our newest Rotarian.
Thank you, President Cindy, fellow Rotarians. Well, it is my honor to introduce today Brenda Kibbe. Brenda is currently a manager of Enterprise Project and Change Management at Sanford. I've known Brenda for many, many years. She's volunteered with United Way for close to 30 years and served as the board chair in 2022. Brenda has a long history of mentoring. That's one of the ways that we first got to know each other. 20 years she's mentored with the Lutheran Social Services school-based mentoring program. Brenda is local. So many people I meet grew up in small towns or relocated, but she's one of the few that was born and raised in Sioux Falls. She graduated from Washington High School in that, even I'm not that dumb. But I will let Brenda tell you a little bit more about herself. So please welcome Brenda.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited to join as a Rotarian today. As Joel said, I grew up in Sioux Falls here. My husband and I have a daughter who lives in Florida, and we'll be heading down there for our grandson's graduation this next week. Really excited about joining the Rotary and really understanding how I might be able to engage in our community in a different way. I do a ton of volunteering, as Joel said, both with Lutheran Social Services mentoring, the MB Women's Leadership Program mentoring, junior achievement, and a host of other things. So just looking for ways to further engage. So very excited to be here today.
Our next member induction will be done by Steve Williamson. Steve, head on up.
Cindy, fellow Rotarians, my name is Steve Williamson, Director of the Foundation at Southeast Technical College. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you to a really great guy today, super smart, Eric Gilbertson. Eric grew up in the political aristocracy of pure South Dakota. He is an Augustana graduate. He has steadily moved up the chain of command, starting at, various places, but then Bailey, and now at Dorsey Whitney, where he works with a lot of money. And he is going to be a wonderful addition to Rotary, and just, I hope you get a chance to meet him, because he's just really a great guy. He's been in part of the leadership Sioux Falls. So everybody, Eric Gilbertson.
Wow, thank you, Stephen. I did not pay him to say that, but I want to take him with me everywhere to be my professional hype man now. That was fantastic. Thank you, President Cindy, fellow Rotarians. I also have to extend a thank you to any of those in leadership. Stephen mentioned Leadership Sioux Falls. There was an invite that came to us to just come and check out Rotary, and that's the reason I'm here and joining, quite honestly. Before that, Rotary, I knew of it, never really had any engaging conversations before then. On account of coming to those, in Stephen's words, it very well scratches the itch of being involved in conversations and discussions that you probably wouldn't otherwise have. And there's a person who can take credit, Laura. I didn't see you before, so thank you. She was the messenger for that invite. Briefly on me, Stephen, he let a little bit out. Any conversations you'd like to have about income tax, that's the sandbox I play in primarily at the trust company. I work with a very talented group of people there for income tax, our clients. I know that's not always a conversation starter, so if you'd like to converse about other things, the real highlights for me, my wife and I, Lauren, we have 2 boys. They're 2.5 and 9 months. Stephen also alluded to, I was not part of the political aristocracy in Pierre. I do have time there with family, also in the northeast corner in the Sisseton and Webster areas. South Dakota's a small place, so I'm sure we can start some conversations there. But I look forward to those conversations, and thank you, everyone.
Our third induction today is actually a new member is going to introduce to a new member. How special is that? Eric Barnes, you are up next.
Thank you. Hello, fellow Rotarians. It's my honor to introduce Melissa Fossil to you all here today. She has over a decade of banking experience in Sioux Falls. She recently joined the FMBO team as their Director of Commercial Banking in Sioux Falls and continues to partner with businesses in their financial needs. She's originally from Southwest Minnesota and a graduate from SDSU. Go Jacks. Thank you. Glad to hear that. Cheering on the Jackrabbits continues to keep her busy, and in her spare time she is the chauffeur and logistics coordinator for her 3 daughters. When she's not doing that, she volunteers as a Sioux Empire Starters in Sioux Falls Zoo and Aquarium, where she serves as the director. With any spare time she has left, she coaches youth sports and enjoys traveling to new places. So here's Melissa.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank Lynn Keller Forbes for the encouragement to apply to Downtown Rotary. I'd also like to thank President Cindy and you, the Downtown Rotarians, for the acceptance into the club. I'm eager to start attending these downtown luncheons and become engaged in the organization. Like Eric had mentioned, within this past year, I've taken on a new opportunity with a Nebraska-based bank, FMBO, helping lead their efforts of bringing the bank back to Sioux Falls. We currently have offices in the southwest part of town, but later this year, early next year, we'll be moving to downtown Sioux Falls, which we're really excited for. Our Sioux Falls office consists of commercial banking, home mortgage lending, and trust advisory services. As we have eagerly brought the products and services of FMBO back to Sioux Falls, we've been welcomed and encouraged by the residents, businesses, and organizations of the city. FMBO's motto is the great big small bank. When I think about Sioux Falls, it fits right into that tagline. It's the great big small city. Sioux Falls is growing, but at the core of the community are still those small town values, which is what attracted me to FMBO and why I'm proud to be part of this growing team we have in Sioux Falls. One more thing I'll mention before I step down from the podium, and when I was doing a little bit of research on Rotary before applying, I was reading through the objects of Rotary, which are highly related to acquaintance, service, and connecting your personal community and business life through that ideal of service. I believe this fits perfectly with how I strive to live and sincerely admire those grounding principles and look forward to advancing these ideals in the city of Sioux Falls through Rotary. Thank you so much.
Hard not to be filled with energy listening to everyone's why, and we're so glad to have all of you as part of the Downtown Rotary family. Let's move on to today's program. We are switching up the format a bit. Our moderator, Rotarian Andrew Curley, he is going to host 3 separate conversations about carbon pipelines with representatives from Navigator and Summit Pipeline Projects, as well as former Minnehaha County Commissioner Jeff Barth. I'm going to invite Andrew on the stage to join me, and as he makes his way, so can our first guest. Joining him first will be Elizabeth Burns Thompson. She is Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for Navigator CO2. Following their discussion, we'll hear from Sabrina Zener, Sabrina Zener, Director of Community Relations for Summit Carbon Solutions, and then Mr. Barth. Andrew, take it away.
Thank you, President Cindy. This will be an exciting conversation. Before I introduce Elizabeth, I'm going to do a little bit of stage setting as far as the what and the why of this conversation. So first, the what. In 2021, Summit Carbon Solutions announced a partnership with multiple ethanol plants in South Dakota to develop a carbon capture pipeline, Midwest Carbon Express, that would traverse portions of South Dakota. Then in 2022, Navigator CO2. Mic on now. Keep going, all right. Navigator CO2 announced plans to develop a similar pipeline, the Greenway project, that will travel through portions of South Dakota. Both companies have submitted siting permits with the PUC and are working through that process. Am I doing something? Is that better? All right. So that's the what. Then the why. In part, these projects are driven, and we'll talk a little bit about to what degree, by government policies targeted at, with the intended purpose of reducing carbon output in the U.S. and to meet global greenhouse gas emission standards. First introduced in 2008, the 45Q tax credit is a tax credit on each metric ton of carbon captured and sequestered. This credit has been modified and expanded several times, including in 2018 and 2020 under President Trump, but then in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, signed into law by President Biden, increased and expanded the 45Q credit from $50 per ton to $85 per ton, in part creating a market for these pipelines. In South Dakota, we've seen a heated debate at the local, county, and state level regarding these projects, and today we're going to dive into the specifics of each project, and as well as hear some of the concerns that these have brought about. So, Elizabeth, we'll read your bio here quickly. Elizabeth is the Vice President of Government Relations for Navigator. Prior to joining Navigator, Burns Thompson served as Manager of Corporate Affairs for the Renewable Energy Group, the largest producer of biodiesel in North America. Her roots run deep in agriculture, having grown up on a family farm in eastern Iowa, also starting her career working with farmers and for farmers at the Iowa Farm Bureau and the Iowa Corn Growers Association. She holds a JD from Drake Law School with a specialization in agricultural law and policy, and a BS in agricultural business and international agriculture from Iowa State University. Thank you for being here, Elizabeth. First, before we get into the specifics of your project, can you just explain what carbon capture and sequestration is?
Sure. And for those that know me, they know that I'm commonly, I'll go by my acronym, which is EBT, my initials. You'll hear a lot of acronyms throughout this. So CCS, I'm going to throw another letter in there. CCUS is actually what it has kind of evolved into. And at its core, it's carbon management. So what we're looking to develop, and I'll walk through a little bit of the process, but is taking carbon, what is now, in many cases, a waste product, developing it in infrastructure so that you can manage that, so that it can become a valuable commodity. How you do that, or what the essence of the steps are of carbon capture, utilization, and storage or sequestration, you'll hear that word thrown out as well, is we're capturing the carbon at the industrial processor. In many cases, that's an ethanol plant. That CO2 is coming off the fermenters right now. So in essence, we're capturing that CO2. It goes through a compressor. That's where it goes through that phase change. So think back to chemistry, from a gas into a liquid for all intensive purposes. It's technically supercritical, but it goes into that liquid state. It'll move through that network of transportation infrastructure, also known as a pipeline, ultimately to end destinations. And I'll say S because there are multiple. In our case, we have our sequestration sites that we're developing in central Illinois. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about how all that works a little bit later. But also along that platform or piece of infrastructure is other off-ramps, terminals. Think accessibility to CO2 along the footprint, as well as the end destination for sequestration. So at the end of the day, what we're looking to develop is accessibility to a product throughout kind of the footprint holistically.
Great, that's helpful. So let's talk a little bit about your specific project. So the high-level details, where you're starting, where you're going, why you chose Central Illinois as your endpoint, in some of the states that you're traversing through, and then maybe some of your partners, some of the ethanol producers you're working with.
Sure. So what you'll see if I had done my homework a little bit better and provided a map, as Andrew had asked us to do, but let this be a request to visit our website. On our Heartland Greenway website, you'll see a map of our project footprint. So we traverse 5 states here across the Corn Belt, being Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and South Dakota. Work on the fly here. We have about 1,300 miles in phase 1. I'll talk about phases because we are uniquely situated in that we've got a couple different iterations of development. But in phase 1, we're connecting 21 processors, 20 of those being ethanol plants across those 5 states. We do also have an anhydrous ammonia facility down in southeast Iowa. In South Dakota, it's just over 110 or 111 miles, in phase 1. We have 3 ethanol plants in the first phase. We'll connect an additional 3 at least in phase 2. So what does that look like? That's 1,300 miles. What that represents is about 1,500 unique parcels of land and about 4,200 landowners. So when we go into, I think probably a little bit later about what's that look like in terms of process, it takes a while to talk to 4,200 people. So these are types of projects that are measured progress in terms of really months, not necessarily days and weeks.
You said there's 3 plants current on phase 1 in South Dakota?
Correct.
And am I correct, all 3 of those, are they pullet plants?
No, so we have the Valero ethanol facility up in Aurora. We'll also have Hudson and Chancellor on the Poet footprint, and then Big Stone, Groton, and Mitchell also within Poet, which would be on a phase 2 part of our build-out.
Gotcha. And one question I know that's come up with this, the idea of the pipeline, why do you need a pipeline? Why can't the ethanol plant capture it and sequester it on site?
Sure. So kind of back to the fundamentals of accessibility to marketplaces. So some of that being sequestration, some of that potentially being use. You necessarily need to aggregate it. But to the core, we'll get to the heart of your question first, is why not just develop an injection well right here in South Dakota, or right there in Iowa, or right there in Minnesota? And the fact of the matter is the geology throughout the Midwest is not uniform. While the landscape might look a lot similar from state to state, when you go about a mile underground, there is quite a bit of difference. And so when you're looking at the areas that are necessary for this type of deep geological sequestration, you functionally need a couple different things at its core. You need an area of porosity. So think of it kind of like I grew up on a farm, so think of it like a 5-gallon bucket of sand, right? You can fill that bucket full of water, right? There's porosity between those grains of sand. You need that at that layer. What necessarily you also need is the function here is to make sure that reducing carbon emissions, right? So we can't have that CO2 coming right back up out of the ground. You need that capstone. That capstone necessarily is not permeable. So it effectively serves as a seal to seal that CO2 from coming back up. You need both of those to a certain size and scale. One, to ensure that you've got the space for CO2, but then also a robust capstone or cap rock that's not going to fracture, right? Think of it almost like the opposite of fracking, where they're looking at fracturing that capstone to bring something out. We actually need to maintain the integrity of that cap rock to ensure that that CO2 is staying underground. And that does not exist, like I said, uniformly throughout the United States.
Gotcha. So you talked a little bit about creating opportunities, creating market. So what's the benefit to both the ethanol producers as well as the agriculture producers for this project?
Sure. What I used to have in my office back when I was at the Corn Growers and a couple of my other jobs here recently too, there was a display. And there was probably maybe half a dozen different things in each little canister. And what they represented were all of the different products that came out of an ethanol plant, right? So if you think about the functional purposes, a farmer drives in, they deliver their grain, and out of that plant comes half a dozen different very valuable products. But we still call them an ethanol plant, right? They were developed to take grain and turn it into an alcohol. The rest of those products, be it the DDGs, the corn oil, and now CO2, right, have all been, at one point, byproducts, are now very valuable co-products. There's one remaining thing in that setup display that sits on my desk right now that doesn't really have that robust marketplace, and that's the CO2. You necessarily can take that and turn what is really the last remaining byproduct of an ethanol plant and turn it into the last remaining valuable co-product, thus adding value to that individual facility, the community that that facility resides in, as well as every farmer that delivers grain into that plant.
So I'm touching on that, that market that it creates. To what degree does that 45Q tax credit play into the marketability or making that into a product, the CO2?
Sure. So there's a lot of policies that tax policies, incentives, both at the federal level, state level. I think taking a step back, if you look at where our biggest marketplaces are for ethanol right now, it's California and it's Canada. Both of those entities have something in common. They both have robust carbon-based fuel programs. So in addition to, be it 45Q, a new program, 45Z, which came out under the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, those are all federal incentives. Our biggest marketplaces, i.e. our customers right now, are demanding lower carbon fuel. You'll hear me mention that it's not good enough today just to produce green fuel. We have to find a way to produce a green fuel in an increasingly greener fashion, because that's frankly what our customers are demanding. And this, to further quantify that, because I know folks like numbers, right? So what does that mean? Well, a facility, one of our partner plants that partners with this type of technology, and or the project you hear from afterwards, a gallon of ethanol coming out of that facility right now that adopts carbon capture has the ability to reduce that carbon score by upwards of about 50%. So if you think of carbon as a quantifiable value, a quantifier of value of each gallon of ethanol, you're effectively improving that value upwards of 50% per gallon.
Great, okay. So let's talk about the milestones that you have within your project. You talked about 4,200 landowners. You need easements. How's that process going? How many have you signed up so far? What's been the reception? And then talk a little bit about the compensation and how you work with the landowner if they've got concerns. What's that process look like for your company?
Sure. So that is the $1 million question, or I'll call it the $2.2 million question, because that's the number I'm going to give you, of how much money we have spent in South Dakota to date on right-of-way. We're not quite to a point of doing a very detailed kind of percentage by percentage, but we are continuing to make great progress. I mentioned before that this is robust infrastructure necessitates a robust timeline. This is a matter of months, not necessarily weeks. We really came to market and began negotiating with landowners back in October of last year. For those of you that are familiar with kind of the agricultural cycle, that fell right on top of harvest, unfortunately. A predominant amount of the land that we cover across is agricultural land. So we did struggle to get in front of folks right off the bat, but that in terms of the holidays as well, we have now gone out and been able to have really constructive conversations with landowners. Again, that takes time. In South Dakota, it's well over 300 landowners, give or take, in that. And we want to make sure, I think, as you take a step back, because that is the question is what's the percentage. I think we look at negotiation also far too simple. When we come in and start negotiating with a landowner, it's more than just dollars and cents, and necessarily so, right? How we do that work is important. Where we do the work, right? The physical footprint, the location of the line in and of itself is also a term that is absolutely negotiable. In addition to the dollars and cents obviously associated with the compensation for the project as well. Compensation is another thing. What does that look like? It's also multifaceted. So there is compensation for the easement itself, right? So the ability to legally use the land to cross across. With the pipeline. That falls into a couple different buckets on what is the permanent side of the easement and what we have from a temporary construction corridor as well. There's another bucket of compensation related to impacts of the project. Think of that like your crop loss, right? So we're paying about 250% of yield loss up front, right? A showing of goodwill. Regardless of whether or not a landowner even experiences 250% of crop loss. There's also art in how we do that math, right? Some folks may do a corn bean rotation traditionally, some may not. They may want to adjust how we do that math so that it more accurately reflects their operation. They may want to use county averages. Some may want to actually use their own yield history, right? We can adjust how we do that math based on, again, the negotiations with the landowner. And then the last or the third bucket there, which is a little more difficult to define, is any other all damages, right? So think about, we cross across a pasture, the repairs necessary for a fence. I'm getting the eye that maybe I've gotten a little long here, but it is important that compensation model is not a one-size-fits-all either, right? Necessarily no two parcels of land are the same, and so the compensation of those necessarily need to be unique as well.
Gotcha. I just have two other things I want to make sure we got through with each project was, one, the PUC process. So where are you at in the process with your siting application to PUC and kind of what are the next steps there?
Sure. So I believe we put our application in South Dakota the very end of September of last year. One of the things famous for taking a step back, right? But taking a step back and comparing the processes in the states are very different. What we at Navigator have tried very hard to do is to provide a level of uniformity to the best of our abilities. But for example, in South Dakota, with the PUC, they do public input meetings, I believe is the technical term, but they do that after you've got your permit filed, many months after. I think we did ours in late November, actually. In Iowa, that's the very first step in the process. In fact, we can't even talk to a landowner until we've sent out a notice for that meeting and had that public town hall. In Illinois, we can't negotiate until we've got an application filed. So you can see where as a landowner, especially landowners that may sit on the edge between one jurisdiction or the other, it could get confusing. So what we tried to do when I started in the middle part of 2021 and we were really bringing this project forward is, even though things may not have been required, so for example, the South Dakota informational meetings not being required, we came and did them up here anyway, right? We came and did town halls throughout the community. We did virtual meetings the exact same way that we did in Iowa and other jurisdictions so that landowners had the same accessibility to information at the same point in the process, even though it may not match, line for line of what was required by the state. But there are differences. Another thing I would point out, differences in process, eminent domain, condemnation. You haven't brought it up yet, I will, in Iowa, that is very much a function of the utilities board permit, right? So those are looked at under the same authority as the one that's granting those authorities, both with the operational permit as well as authority for condemnation. In South Dakota, that's very different, right? The PUC is the entity that gives that siting permit. It is truly entirely through the court of law that we would go through condemnation or the processes for eminent domain. So again, I give that background because it's very difficult to give a simple answer of how does this work because it is so unique from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Great. I'm going to tell Sabrina she's on deck. So any last thoughts on your project? And then the last thing I would just ask you to touch on is what's the ideal timeline as far as if everything goes well, when could you see construction on this project?
Sure. So what does the road ahead look like? Right now we are very much largely focused in right-of-way work. So again, working with landowners. I see a couple of county commissioners in here. We've done an immense amount of work also with a lot of the county level governments. There's I think a learning opportunity for a lot of folks. We don't build pipelines each and every day, right? It's something that comes around every 5-10 years possibly, and so not everyone is familiar with what exists at the federal level in terms of oversight. How does that interplay with the permitting process that exists at the state level, and then what effectively is also within the scope of local and county governments, because each of those necessarily do have a voice in the process. Necessarily, they're not duplicative or overlapping, but there should be voices in all of the layers of regulatory oversight. So looking ahead, we're going to continue to collaborate with our siting entities, our local governments, and continuing to work with landowners as we work forward. Back to your point, when do we start putting shovels in the ground? We do intend to likely do that the latter part of next year, hoping to have the first wave of plants operational on our line by 2025.
Great, thank you.
Yes, thank
We'll do
you.
a swap, and just note that each of the participants will be around afterwards if there are any specific questions you might have. While Sabrina's making her way to the stage, I'll get to her bio. Sabrina Zena is the Director of Marketing and Communications for Summit Carbon Solutions. She's motivated by a deep passion for sustainability and understanding changing global markets, and has a high desire to help rural communities in Midwest continue to thrive. She had a decade-long career as a trusted local news anchor in Des Moines, and she has exceptional communication skills to her role. She joined Summit Carbon Solutions in July and works with stakeholders across the project's footprint. She was born and raised in Iowa and lives and works there with her husband and 3-year-old twins. Happy belated Mother's Day.
Thank you.
And she graduated from the University of Kansas School of Journalism.
Rock Chalk.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Sabrina. So I guess let's just talk specifically about your project.
Yes.
The route, the mileage, what states you're going through, and why you selected where you're ending, because you're kind of going in the opposite directions
We are.
from Navigator. So
Yes.
dig in a little bit to that.
We are 5 states, Summit Carbon Solutions. We are starting in Iowa, and similar to Navigator, it's a gathering system. So and the main line goes through Iowa, South Dakota, and then into North Dakota, where they also have the correct geological formation to be able to sequester in North Dakota. We're just northwest of Bismarck. And then we're also gathering from Minnesota and Nebraska. It's a total of 2,000 miles of pipeline, about 200 miles here in the state of South Dakota.
And how many ethanol plants, specifically in South Dakota?
Okay, so we have 32 ethanol plants across the project currently contracted. And then a 33rd, which is GEVO, the Sustainable Aviation Fuel plant that's happening here in South Dakota, will be on the line, but of course right now it's under construction. So that'll be a separate permitting process. So that makes 33 plants total. That's, if you include GEVO, 8 plants in South Dakota for owners in South Dakota. 7 and 3 if you don't include GEVO.
Gotcha. And then is Summit looking at the market for this any differently than, say, a Navigator, or how would you address the market for the agriculture producers and the ethanol plants?
What Elizabeth said is spot on. I think I'll add just a couple things, and I brought a cheat sheet because numbers are not my thing. I'm a journalist by trade. So, the state of South Dakota produces 1.3 billion gallons of ethanol every single year. The state of South Dakota uses 45 million. So there has to be a market for all of the ethanol that is produced. Glacial Lakes Energy alone will produce in a month and a half all of the ethanol that the state of South Dakota will use in a year. So there has to be a market, and the global demand for fuel is low carbon. We are responding to the market. That's one point that I want to make sure that everybody really understands, but also 62% of all corn that is produced in the state of South Dakota goes to ethanol plants. Without these ethanol plants, if these ethanol plants don't have a market for their ethanol, then these farmers don't have a market for their corn.
Gotcha. And then just one technical question. Are there other, you have something to add?
Do you have more on economic development? Are you going to ask me about that, or should I get to that?
No, go ahead.
Just a couple other points I want to make sure we make here. So it's been really interesting because I work in all 5 states and have had a lot of conversations with county commissioners who are coming to us and saying, okay, fine, we understand that PHMSA regulates safety, the state regulates the route of the pipeline, but we want to regulate economic development and understand that there are economic development opportunities. And in that same breath, they're seeing requests for information coming from, in Woodbury County in Iowa, Carbon Sync reached out to these county commissioners and said, we want to bring our plant to Woodbury County, but we will only do that if we can be on the Summit Carbon Solutions line. There was another company, Project Press here in South Dakota reached out to the governor's office and said, we want to be able to come to the state of South Dakota and have a plant here, but we have to be on the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline. So there are opportunities for investment into these communities from large companies, but they will only do that if they have the opportunity to lower their carbon intensity score, lower that CI score that Elizabeth was telling you about, that will cut it in half with the flip of a switch of our project. They have to be able to lower the carbon intensity score of their facility in order to make it an economically viable option for them.
Essentially, it's becoming, from an economic development world, part of their RFP process.
Yes, exactly.
For saying, we gotta have access.
We've got to have
it.
access to capture our carbon.
And are there any other carbon pipelines in South Dakota or in?
In North Dakota, there are 205 miles that have operated safely for 20 years.
So on your project, talk a little bit about the milestones there too, the easements, the number of easements, because you guys have been at it for a little bit longer.
Yeah, we
Where are you at
signed-
in that process?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I get very excited. We signed our first voluntary easement in the state of South Dakota in December of 2021. So we have been at it for a year and 5 months or 6 months, but a year and 6 months, a year and a half is not that long in terms of a real pipeline project. Traditionally, it takes years to gather as many easements. We're at 70% across the project, across our 5 states, and we're at 70% of voluntary easements in the state of South Dakota. That's like record-splitting, fast pace to garner these voluntary easements. And I mean, in March of last year, we were at 3% across the project. Now May of this year, 70.
So 70% voluntary easements. Obviously, not all of them are voluntary. So, those are all 70%.
All of the easements that we have secured are 100% voluntary.
I'm saying there's a possibility that all of this could end up being voluntary. So there's been talk of eminent domain, Elizabeth brought it up a little bit. Your company has started engaging that eminent domain process. Can you talk to us about how your company thinks through when to use eminent domain, when it's necessary?
The goal of our project is 100% voluntary easements, but also, as Elizabeth was mentioning, some of these processes take years. These regulatory and judicial processes are years long. So if we want to be able to continue to stay on our timeline, we have to understand the legal process and how long those things take. Eminent domain does not make friends. And if we have friends and then we start using eminent domain, we do not keep friends. So our goal is 100% voluntary easements, but we continue to work with these landowners every single day. We are negotiating with landowners here in the state of South Dakota every day. Some landowners have decided to stop working with us, and we have to continue the process. If those landowners want to come back to the table, we are here. If you know any of those landowners and they want to come back to the table, I have my card. I will share it with you. We want voluntary easements. That is our goal.
And then the other issue, eminent domain being one of the hot topics, the other one has been safety.
Yes.
So you talk a little bit about the safety of these pipelines and kind of what Summit's hazard mitigation plan would be.
Yep. I love a good visual. Luckily, Trevor Jones is here. So he brought these pipe samples. They're right here. These are the smaller sizes, because if you wanted to see a 24-inch pipe, it would be too heavy for at least me to pick up. So I do have to be able to carry my 3-year-old twins, so it's not, nobody wants to throw their back out today. They're really heavy. You have to feel the pipe to understand how safe it is. In addition to that, PHMSA, the regulatory body that makes sure that all pipelines across the country are run in a safe way, PHMSA has regulations like, say, X-raying 10% of the welds. Our project is committed to X-raying 100% of the welds. We are going to exceed the regulations that are set forth by PHMSA, because safety is the #1 concern for us. And if you ever, many of you, I'm sure, have experienced conversations with Aaron Eldridge. He's our South Dakota project manager, and the way that he explains safety is by far my favorite, because it's like way over my head. He talks about I'm not even going to try it, but it's the way that we are constructing the pipeline is the safest pipeline that will ever be built. And to think about like the FAA, how they regulate airplanes and airlines. Trevor Jones, I'm going to steal his analogy. He always talks about how every time something happens, every time there's an incident with a plane, the FAA learns from it and regulates and makes sure that those problems don't happen again. The pipeline industry is the same way, and we have to continue to learn. But if you are driving a car built in 1933 versus a car built today, the safety measures that that car will take are so much greater than what was built in 1933. It's the same thing for a pipeline. The pipeline built today will always be the safest pipeline ever built. And pipeline transport in general is the safest form of transport for any type of commodity like this. Because think about how many rail accidents we see. I mean, driving on a highway, a semi-truck turned over. Pipeline transport is by far the safest form of transport that exists.
Got it. So before we bring up Commissioner Barth, any last thoughts? And then also the same kind of question, what's your timeline for this project?
I think the most important thing to understand here is that the market is demanding a lower carbon intensity score for fuel. Lower carbon fuel is necessary for the economies of states like South Dakota, Iowa, where my home is, North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Illinois too. These markets are demanding it, and we are responding to the demands from the market. And it's not just, these companies like Summit Carbon Solutions or Navigator are going to come in and make all this money. Of course, there's profit in it, but this will also profit all of the local rural communities, that not just along our line, but in the entire state, because we are here to continue to enhance the viability of rural communities, the viability of ethanol, and be able to see these rural communities persist for decades to come. We will not take decades to be operational. We will have our permitting hearing here for South Dakota mid-September, have our permit before the end of the year. We're hopeful to have all of our permits and construction begun next year, and then we'll be fully operational very start of 2025.
2025. Great. Well, thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Next up, we've got Jeff Barth. Jeff is no stranger to this crowd. He's a longtime Minnehaha County resident with a successful career in telecommunications. He served on 16 years on the County Commission in Minnehaha County, and in 2022 ran for a seat on the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission, in part talking about some of these topics. So thank you, Commissioner Barth, for being here. Can you just start off sharing what are some of your main concerns with these projects?
Well, clearly, some of my concerns are that the whole story isn't being told. And you look at the the voluntary easements. Well, I just heard about someone who was meeting with one of these pipeline people in their living room, and the next day they found out they were being sued for eminent domain. They're not operating without intimidation. They have teams of attorneys, teams of lobbyists. I remember when I worked at the phone company, one of my technicians was threatened by a customer. I'm going to sue you. And he said, our team of attorneys is waiting for a call from your attorney. And that's what's going on here. Teams of attorneys, teams of lobbyists, teams of agents coming out and putting the pressure on people. That said, there are good decisions being made by some. But from my point of view, there's the danger of the explosion, not explosion, but eruption, under incredible pressure, 2,100 pounds per square inch, and a pipeline that, if it was stretched out, would go from Sioux Falls to Havana, Cuba, and back. That's how long this pipeline is, of steel. How much carbon is created by manufacturing all of that iron and steel? A lot. There are alternatives to pipelines. For example, direct extraction from the air. Occidental Petroleum is doing that down in Texas, and they're using it for fracking. Now, they'll say it's expensive, but this is expensive too. We're talking about, according to Steve King, former congressman from Iowa, $18 billion over the next 3 years. $4.5 billion is certainly right on top. And with that kind of expense, I don't know why we need to do the easiest way, the cheapest way, cheapest for the billionaires and millionaires who are behind this. There are some folks in Iowa who have put huge efforts into this. They have ethanol in Iowa, they have ethanol in Brazil. And I don't believe California wants liquid fuel anymore. They want electricity. So we can do all we want with ethanol, but it's not going to go anywhere. I believe that ethanol's been valuable. It's been valuable to our state, but it's a bridge, not a destination. It's taking us to where we're going. And, do you think we'll be using ethanol in 100 years? Heck, 100 years ago, we were probably still using whale oil or something. The fact is, it's going to change, and this pipe will be in the ground forever. It's going to scar our land, endanger our people, and I'm against it.
So the concerns aren't necessarily project-specific. In general, you would say this isn't the best way to reduce
I would say that.
CO2 in the atmosphere.
By the way, I had to search through the closet to find a pair of socks that matched my shirt. It's the way I roll.
So you are a former county commissioner and a former candidate for the PUC. So what are your thoughts for, if you're a county commissioner today, what recommendations would you have, or what would you like to see county commissions actions taken on
I would like
these?
them to take advantage of the opportunity that the PUC admits that they have to express the opinion of local government. According to their own paperwork, they take into account the opinions of local government. And our local government, in my opinion, should say no. If they put these pipelines through Minnehaha County, you can't build houses on it, you can't build all kinds of other projects, you can't build schools nearby. It's going to crimp our opportunities for other kinds of economic activity. And so I would favor us saying to the PUC, put it in Harding County. I worked as a county commissioner. I was on our planning and zoning. And, we had to look at projects and decide what's the best use of this land. This pipeline, this total, I think, 3,700 miles of pipe, it's not the best use of our land. And let's put an air extraction up in, direct air extraction up in North Dakota. Occidental uses the same product to frack for oil down in Texas. So on the one hand, you're cleaning the environment, and on the other hand, you're pumping out more fossil fuel. It's just, there are some things that I just can't put up with.
So you'd like to see the local governments, particularly the county commissions, express their thoughts to the PUC. If you were on the PUC, what actions would you like to see the PUC take as they come to these
I would listen to, both sides, obviously. But I must admit, when Dan Lederman first pitched the pipeline projects to the Minnehaha County Commission, I was kind of interested. And I don't have a dog in the fight, and at that time, I didn't have the information I do now. But as it went forward, I studied the issues, I found out more and more about it. There are alternatives. They're going to pay $85 a ton to put this in the ground. You can plant trees and take the same carbon out of the air at $50 a ton. Which is better? A dangerous pipeline buried who knows where, or a few trees? I favor trees.
So talk a little bit about eminent domain. And I believe during your campaign for PUC, your tagline was no eminent domain for private gain.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on eminent domain. When do you think it's appropriate to use, and why do you think this is not the appropriate?
I think it's appropriate to use if you need to put a naval base to defend the United States. It's appropriate to use to build an interstate highway. It's appropriate for a water reservoir or stuff like that. But this is like an eternal game just for these people. It'll make them billions. And the farmers are going to be left with a one-time payment and an unexploded bomb in their field. I just don't favor that project. And I don't think that using the powers of the state to confiscate your land for private use is the right thing to do. I know they'll say, but we can pipe other stuff too. Well, how would you feel if it was a cyanide pipeline through your yard? This is certainly not cyanide, but the fact is it will asphyxiate you if it were to erupt. It would freeze you. And it's been shown to do that. There was an accident, not an accident, but a volcanic lake in Cameroon flipped over, and tons of CO2 were released, killing more than 1,000 people. And this stuff is dangerous. Your car won't operate in it, and in meeting with other folks, our fire department people wanted to get training on using it or responding, and the pipeline people said, well, give us the names of all the people that you want us to train. Are we supposed to hand over the personal info of our county volunteers? No, it's just not the right project. Again, for the same bucks, we could do a great job of extracting CO2 from the air in North Dakota. Iceland has got a project now where they're shooting it into the ground, but they're only doing a couple thousand tons, I believe, and this is millions. We don't know if it will work. I just saw today's news about a coal plant in, I don't know where it was, Mississippi, that they imploded. It was supposed to be a project where they would burn coal without any CO2 leaving the plant. Didn't work. And there's no reason to believe that you can put 30 million tons down into the ground right there and have it accomplish it under incredible pressure with danger for every community that it goes by. The folks in Leola, McPherson County, there's supposed to be a pump station near them. They feel if it were to erupt, that a cloud could cover Leola for several hours, and the fire department would not be able to respond. People would die. So it's bad for the land. A gal I know here in Minnehaha, she had the oil pipeline cross her land, and now she's growing boulders and pop cans in that land, not corn. And, it's dangerous to people, and it'll last, it'll be in the ground for 1,000 years.
So on the eminent domain conversation, obviously that's a matter of state law. We saw a lot of debate over this topic at the state legislative session this last year. Were there any and none of those changes became law, but were there any in particular that you were advocating for or you'd hoped would have passed?
I was hoping that they would revise their laws. This is really a bipartisan issue because Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. helped put this into law to pay off Joe Manchin, I think. And our legislature in Iowa and South Dakota, they wouldn't touch it. They're allowing it to go through. I'd like to wonder how much these companies have donated to those legislators and legislatures in these states. I know Iowa, they just appointed 2 more people to their utilities board without any hearing at all. It stinks.
So there's the main source of concern from landowners, and is there an organized effort on behalf of landowners who are concerned?
They're up in Leola today at a rally at the courthouse. But yes, landowners are definitely organized and opposing this. And but they're just a few thousand landowners going against billions of dollars of international manipulation. Let's see what will happen, but mark my words, the disruption will be great and the payoff. California does not want liquid fuel. Ethanol is a bridge, not a destination.
So besides landowners who may be impacted by this project, why would someone else be concerned about this? Why is the average person in the Rotary audience who maybe doesn't have land that this is going to cross, why should they be concerned?
Well, one landowner I talked to rents out his land in the summer for camping. So you're camping, you don't know that there's a pipeline there, which if it were to erupt, the gas would stay low to the ground, it's cold, it's heavy, and blow into your campground potentially. I know that Wildwater West was worried about that. There you are in your swimsuit, just about to lose oxygen. What would be the response of the regional fire departments? It's scary in so many ways, and yet at the same time, I think Sabrina and Elizabeth did a good job explaining things, but I think they left off some things that didn't favor their argument as much. And I favor finding a way to do with all this carbon in the atmosphere. I just think that if, let's not do it to enrich a few people, let's do it for the world. I'm proud to be an American, and I want to take care of America.
All right, well, any remaining thoughts before we turn back over to Cindy?
No, but I do appreciate being invited, and I think this is the first time I tied a tie since last December. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here. Let's give a round of applause to Jeff and Elizabeth and Sabrina.
Well, Andrew, this was tremendously informative. Thank you all for bringing your expertise and your lens to this conversation so that we as Rotarians can leave more informed than we walked into the door. Next week, May 22nd, A Tale of Two Cities. Stay tuned for your emails on more details about that. And can we believe that 2 weeks from today is Memorial Day? So we will not be hanging out and seeing each other on May 29th. With that, Rotary is adjourned.